I'm Allison Law, and you're listening to the Literary Atlanta podcast, where the almost spring continues, featuring sunny skies, 70-degree days, and blooms and buds shyly opening up, believing we may be safe from another freeze. Still, it's March, and therefore too early to call it in the southeastern U.S. Atlanta's book scene is experiencing a spring renewal, with plenty of events happening all over the city, often 2 to 3 at a time. And one of the busiest authors touring today will visit the city on Wednesday, March 13th. The #1 New York Times best-selling author of the Natchez Burning trilogy is back with a new standalone thriller set in small-town Mississippi. My conversation with Greg Iles about his latest novel, Cemetery Road, is up next on episode 57 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. Greg Iles may think he's reverted back to his first career as a touring musician in the band Frankly Scarlet. The best-selling author is making 2, sometimes 3 book tour stops a day right now in support of his new novel, Cemetery Road, which came out March 5th. With his brother in the driver's seat, Greg spoke to me via phone while en route to an event in St. Louis. We called the SUV his mobile audio unit, but it's really his trusty Ford Flex. Unfortunately, that's not a paid product placement. But it could be. Call us Ford. It's the same vehicle that Marshall McEwen drives in Cemetery Road. The Flex will be stopping at the amazing Foxtail Bookshop in Woodstock, Georgia on Wednesday, March 13th at 2 p.m. While Greg and I cover a lot of territory in this conversation, you may be as surprised as I was to learn that Cemetery Road didn't begin with the new protagonist, Marshall McEwen. Instead, it began at the end with a woman and her darkest secret. This is your first standalone novel in more than a decade. You've bid goodbye to Penn Cage and the Natchez Burning trilogy, and welcome Marshall McEwen. Tell us, how did you build this character? Because I kind of noticed as I was reading that Marshall shares a few characteristics with you, not the least of which is that you both drive a Ford Flex.
I'm in it right now. To tell you the truth, this novel, it didn't really start with a character. It began with the secret that's revealed at the end of the novel, which is, I think, pretty shocking. I went all the way back to the Bible looking to see other literary occurrences of this behavior on the part of a woman, and I didn't see it. But I've come to believe that it's happened a lot in marriages, particularly pre-DNA. And in the same way coroners tell me they believe that a lot of women poison their husbands the days before advanced biochemistry,
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so as far as this is the thing where, a novel that hides a secret like this one, I approach all novels in a different way. But one like this is sort of like constructing a magic trick or a great illusion. You sort of work backwards. And it was time for a break from pen. That consumed 10 years of my life, nearly killed me literally from the car accident, but also just the stress of that much focus on something as unpleasant as real life civil rights murders and those kind of things. And so Marshall to me is sort of a cross between Woodward and Bernstein, who are heroes of mine in my youth, and then a more modern figure like a John Meacham, that you see on MSNBC.
So you started with the big reveal at the end, which we won't talk about because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. It's as usual, you have kind of a shocker there at the end for everybody. When you're living in a small town like Bienville, you don't have to go very far to excavate relics from the past, but you start the book with an archaeologist character. Why did you have the story of Buck Ferris digging through what he believes to be these 4,000-year-old Indian artifacts? Why did you decide to start the book there?
I think because the conventional spine of the novel, let's say, the stuff on which it's hung, the structure, the scaffolding, has to do with the story of a struggling southern town, a Mississippi River town. But, it's not unique to the South. We see that in the Midwest and the steel towns where I'm headed. And it had to do with how desperate people get in that situation. A lot of those towns have slowly degenerated, and I think they've reached tipping points. And so when economic salvation is offered in the form, in this case, of a Chinese paper mill, it was important to have a threat to that salvation, and to see how far will neighbors go, neighbor against neighbor, to keep someone from interfering with that salvation. So in terms of the externalized story, that's why I began with that too. I'm fascinated with that. I know a guy a lot like Buck Ferris, and those kind of ruins and sites exist very near my home. So it's a sort of romantic thing. And also you'll notice that when you get to Marshall's point of view, after that quick sort of prologue chapter,
right,
and Marshall introduces himself, he tells you right out, this is, I'm starting here because this is sort of the way these things conventionally start. It isn't really the true beginning of the story. It's a convenient way for people to get into the story with a dead body, and to, that's what they're used to. They feel comfortable. But I'd say 100 pages in, with the second murder, I pulled the rug out from under their feet.
Mm-hmm. Marshall left home when he was 18 years old for some very good reasons, and now he's returned as a man in midlife. And one of the questions that he seems to be asking throughout the book is, what responsibility does a native son or a native daughter have to his hometown and to the people that they leave behind? You live and work in your hometown of Natchez, Mississippi. Is this a question that you have explored yourself?
It's a question I struggle with now, and I know that people I went to school with struggle with. I started in a public school. I ended in a private school. The educational situation in Natchez is not good right now. Very few people I went to school with can even stay in Natchez if they want to, because there's just not much of a way to make a living there, And so a lot of people would like to return home, but there's no way to do it. Now, I have stayed there. I've tried to, you could say, save the school or work on politics. I got involved in the mayoral election.
Mm-hmm.
I helped run communications, essentially ran them for our gay black mayoral candidate, who won in an old South Southern town with 90% of the vote. How's that, right? You think that might give you some hope.
Pretty compelling.
But I'll tell you, here's how complicated life is in the South. African-American culture is not monolithic. And the real obstacle to the new mayor's progressive ideas turns out not to be the white citizens, but rather the old line sort of black leadership who wants to hold on to power and have it the old way. The South is much more complex than people think it is. But back to your question, do I feel an obligation? I have felt an obligation up till now, and I have stayed there thus far in my life. But I'm reaching a point myself. I'm in my second marriage and have a young son, and I don't know that I can stay to educate my son there. I have a daughter in law school and a son at the University of Virginia, and they did well, but I'm worried, just like everybody in the small towns are worried all across this country.
Yeah. Now, is Bienville really, it seems like it's kind of a combination of places. I'm thinking, is it mostly based on Oxford, or? It's
Bienville, and by the way, you're saying that correctly. A lot of people don't know how to approach that, but you did a good job there.
Thank you.
Bienville is it's got a good dose of Natchez in there, and it's got some other Mississippi towns as well. It's a town that predates the Civil War, and it's a town that knew what wealth was long before most what are now urban areas in America knew what wealth was. And so, there's a certain aristocracy that existed there for a long, long time. Things have changed, but the scions of those families still have their hands on the levers of power, and people anywhere in the South can tell you that it's still a lot like that. But Bienville, I think, will be familiar to anybody from a small town that was once thriving, and it's a great place. Depending on who you are, it can be a great place. It's a great place to set a crime novel, anyway.
For sure. And the reason that I asked about Oxford is because you have Nadine's bookstore and coffee shop there, which.
Well, let me finish that part. Initially, I wasn't going to write Cemetery Road. I initially was writing a book set in Oxford. And I went to school at Ole Miss, but I've never set a novel there. And I had a very noir novel, sort of a combination of Double Indemnity and Body Heat sort of novel that involved literature and writing, which is perfect for Oxford, right? But I was into it about a third of the way, and some little angel or devil on my shoulder kept tapping away, going, "This is not it. This is a great story, but it's not quite the time for this." Whereas the story in Cemetery Road, it really did feel like the time. So I'll tell you this. I'll give this away. The bookstore in Cemetery Road is an amalgam of the signing area of Lemuria Bookstore in Jackson, one of the greatest bookstores ever. It's a little cubby with a banquette. And then Nadine is somewhat based on Lynn Roberts, who the wonderful manager of Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. I kind of figured that out myself the other night when I was there, and we laughed, and I told the crowd. It was great fun.
That's a great amalgamation, though. Two great bookstores. Marshall McLuhan has returned. On the surface, he's come back to help because his father he's really kind of in the last bout of Parkinson's disease and also alcoholism. But beneath the surface, he's kind of gone home to see about a girl. Someone that he first fell in love with like 28 years ago. And this is Jet. And then he has, of course, you have to have the love triangle. He has his other person who, this person is described by different characters in the book as Marshall's best friend. But whoa, who needs, what a complicated friendship he has with Paul.
Friendships can be that way, especially in the South. That when you strip away the trappings of the crime novel or the thriller, what you really have here is a novel about two men in love with the same woman. But this really is the core of the novel. I mean, on the surface, this is certainly an exciting novel and follows somewhat of the conventions of the crime novel as a thriller. But at its core, it's about Marshall and Paul and Jet. And so Marshall left, vowing never to come back. And, Paul stayed, and he married the girl they both loved. And so is it complex? I think it's really cool the way that they ended up in a combat zone together, Marshall as a journalist, Paul as a soldier, and one saves the other's life. There are complex debts between them. But I think Marshall makes a point in the novel that's really important. We can look at Marshall and say, wow, he's betraying his best friend. It's not a cool guy.
Right.
But I think Marshall always felt that Paul never really did love Jet. He wanted her, but I don't think he really loved her in the sense of what real love is. And I think that's why Jet, to a large extent, does what she does in terms of going to Marshall. Now, I think she tried to save Paul at times, but did she love him? I don't think she did, really.
Well, there's a lot of bargaining. That's true, but there's a lot of bargaining that goes on in Marshall's mind, at least, about why or why not his having an extramarital affair is okay.
Well, let's look at it this way. I mean, look, this is something married people are going through all the time. Let's face it. And probably some of the biggest rationalizations ever that go on in the human mind go on around this subject of why I deserve to be with this person even though I'm married to another person. It's going on. You look at some of the most perfect marriages right now. If you knew what was really going on, you'd be stunned because they're in the middle of exactly this kind of situation.
Definitely. You mentioned earlier that Woodward and Bernstein were two of your personal heroes.
Yeah.
And then Marshall is a journalist, and his father is a journalist before him. And then, of course, you had a journalist at the forefront of the Natchez Burning trilogy. How important is journalism to us right now in this country?
I'd say more important right now even than it was during Watergate, or at least certainly equivalent. And I mean, there's another reason that I tended to write protagonists this way, because I'm known as a thriller novelist or a crime novelist, but if you notice, I really never write about the conventional heroes of those books. I don't write about cops or spies or U.S. Marshals or anything like that. I write about writers and mayors and journalists, and because what I like to deal with is people much more closer to you and me facing things they haven't really been trained to deal with, you know? Now, as far as journalism, I think by its nature, it's a heroic pursuit. You don't get paid much money in general. You can get into situations where your life is on the line, and certainly you come face to face with moral quandaries all the time, especially in this time we're living in where, you know, conventional journalism is sort of falling apart, and newspaper journalism, newsrooms are being gutted everywhere, and the internet is consuming it. And so it's just a great character to follow. And I think it's interesting that Marshall, who is a pundit but also has a background in investigative journalism, it's interesting that he goes back to Mississippi and discovers as much corruption really as he left behind in D.C., but it's a good thing because he is trained to deal with that, you know?
One of the things that I enjoy most about your work is your backstories, because I think that it's very easy to get mired down in flashbacks or going too deeply into a character's past, but you really make them feel vital to the story and propel the narrative forward. How much backstory do you write? What does it all get left in, or how much gets edited out at the end?
Well, thanks for feeling that way. Okay, that's a good question. First of all, I would say generally in my novels, the backstory is actually better than the front story. I mean, when you go back to the flashback of Dr. Cage and Viola in the 60s in Natchez Burning, that's the best part of the whole novel. You know? I would say I use all of it. You know, on tour I get asked a lot about writing. And, you know, Scott Turow and I have appeared together quite a bit. Scott and I play in a band together. Scott and I have very different processes, and he writes a lot, and he discards a lot. He distills a lot. He takes more time than I do with a book. And as a result, in general, I would say line by line, Scott's books are much better than mine. You know, I sacrifice that for intensity. I produce my books faster, but I use it all, and I live through every word of it in real time, and I go back very little to change anything. So for me, it's all about intensity. And when I'm into that backstory, like in this book, you know, the scene where the terrible tragedy happens on the river and climbing the tower and all that was written just in one fevered pass. And you do it, and you go back and you go back. And to me, that stuff, I don't know why. Well, I do know why. For one reason is a lot of it, you know, has to do with some version of reality. And so you're processing that, you're living things, reliving them, and you bring back everything you can, and then you set it down, and you never look at it again.
Yeah. There's a part later in the book, in a scene between Marshall and Tim Hayden, where Marshall's talking about the fact that he used to be a musician, and Tim says, "I didn't know you could stop being a musician."
Yeah.
You first started as a touring musician before you were a touring writer. Have you stopped being a musician?
Well, actually, on this tour in Jackson, I took my guitar because I was going to play a Steve Earle song about removing the Confederate imagery from the Mississippi flag, you know, because a while back, John Grisham and I organized the Mississippi writers and artists we took out an ad about, you know, taking the imagery off the flag. And right around that time, Steve Earle wrote a song about that for the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I was going to play this song in Jackson. I had played it at the state capitol, and I wanted to play it at the store. And because I had my guitar on my lap, when people started asking about writing, I started playing snippets of John Prine and Paul Simon and Mac McAnally, a great Mississippi songwriter, to illustrate things about point of view and voice, first person versus third person, and gender, writing cross-gender, like John Prine, Angel from Montgomery. And it was such a wonderful thing, and it went over so well. I've been hauling my guitar around with me, so instead of doing a normal presentation, I'm using the guitar. Now, that's a long answer, but here's the thing. Music absolutely informs writing, if you were lucky enough to be a musician. And the reason is all language has rhythm. I mean, if you're a good writer, it has rhythm. If you're not, it doesn't. And if you understand that, if you've dealt with songwriting and you've dealt with music, you have hopefully an inborn gift and a discipline to evaluate your writing in that. So even though I write fast, I have an absolute conviction about syntax and word order and choice and whatever. And if somebody makes a suggestion to me about changing a word, sometimes I'm just stunned because I think you don't get that. You look at that and you think this is equivalent to that. they're completely unrelated. You know, it would throw the rhythm off completely. So it's just it's a great thing. It's a great gift to have been a musician. And a lot of writers, by the way, were formerly musicians.
Well, do you consider songs literature? And I think your answer would probably yes. Yeah.
Oh, of course. And I mean, look where we're going. Culture's moving so fast. Look at Angie Thomas, who began as a rapper and now is knocking her own self out of #1 with her second book. I mean, that's sort of the newest iteration of that. But I mean, it isn't even a question, you know, are song lyrics literature? I mean, some of the songs I'm playing at these events, they're better than any novel I'll ever write. 2 verses and 2 choruses, better than 600 pages of prose, you know, no question about it.
Well, I guess the debate comes in that, you know, with poetry, you have the rhythm that comes through with, you know, the diction and syntax and where you place things. So Elvis Costello doesn't believe that song lyrics or that songs are literature. But anyhow.
Well, Elvis is just wrong. You know? Plus, you're leaving out, if you studied poetry, but you got to remember, there's a long, long tradition in music of the narrative form, certainly. The confessional form, the narrative form, and it's not just poetry. I would argue some of it is narrative and unbelievably concise, you know. But anyway, we don't have to dwell on that.
I know we could have a long conversation over that, but I'm glad to hear that you will hopefully have your guitar with you in Atlanta.
Oh yeah, I think I will. I don't know if people will be glad or not, but so far they've been glad. Nashville will be the test. We'll see if they can put up with me there.
Yeah, that's a tough crowd right there, a tough room. But I think you're up for it. And I did see a photo on social media with you and Ridley Pearson and Stephen King and Dave Barry. Are you getting the Rock Bottom Remainders back together?
We are. We're playing in Minneapolis in May, a big show. It's going to be it's some new book festival there, and it's going to be, you just get a feeling about certain gigs. It's going to be a big thing, and this is going to be one. And playing with Stephen King, I'm telling you, is just witnessing it is something, but getting to play with him is just, Steve is a punk at heart, man, and it's just, he's like a Ramones fan. It's not what you expect, so I'm looking forward to it.
It's great. The other thing that I want to mention that's it's a little bit of a shift, but you acknowledged on social media this week that it's been 8 years since you had that car accident that almost took you from us. And I wondered at what point in the day that you realized that it was the 8-year anniversary and what it was like to think back on that now that you've had 8 years of distance.
Well, a woman who used to be my assistant, Jane Hargrove, just a wonderful person, posted something the previous night, but I only got 2 hours of sleep that night, so I was in sort of a daze. But the next day, as I was out, beginning the debut, I saw the picture because she had posted that. It just sort of, it just hit me in a real way. You know, it sort of penetrated the daily quotidian stuff, you know, and I just, it doesn't even seem real. You know, you look at a picture like that and you think I was inside that car. But like I said, I got a 1-year-old son, and you think, I try to tell my son this, you know, we go through life denying mortality. I mean, people have asked me about the title of Cemetery Road. What does that refer to? There's a lot of answers to that, but Tom's sort of soliloquy at the end really says it, and that is, we're all on Cemetery Road all the time. We, you know, sometimes we're far enough from the end, or we think we are, to deny it and think about other things. But that's where we're all headed. And American life seems completely geared to just deny the reality of mortality, but you can't. And when something happened like that accident to me, or Steve went through the same thing, you know, he was nearly killed by a drunk driver, and it just, you get slapped on the back of the head by fate, and you hear this voice telling you, you don't have forever to say what you want to say. And you better, as he said in Shawshank Redemption, get busy living or get busy dying.
And Greg is very busy living right now. Not only is he on book tour, but he is working on a number of writing projects, including a film project with his oldest son. Again, if you'd like to catch Greg Iles in the Atlanta area, he's going to be at Foxtail Bookshop in Woodstock on Wednesday, March 13th at 2 p.m. remember, when you can, support these local booksellers and the authors they're hosting by buying a copy of the book at the event. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, you can find links to the people, books, and events mentioned in the podcast on our website. That's literaryatlanta.com. You can listen to episodes there or download them wherever you like to get your podcast. Apple Podcast, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, Radio Public, or TuneIn. I'm Allison Law, your host. Until next time, take care and stay lit curious.